The beaches of Normandy tell a story of unimaginable bravery, but there's a darker side that few talk about. Thousands of soldiers lost their lives, but what happened to their bodies after the battle is rarely discussed. Beneath the glory and triumph of those who fell, there was manipulation, or why this part of the D-Day legacy remains largely untold. Welcome to a new video. Join us as we uncover the terrifying truth. They never told you what happened to the bodies on D-Day. If you enjoy this type of content, subscribe to our channel. It's free. Now, let's begin. The invasion of Normandy. The Normandy landings took place in June 6, 1944, known as D-Day, marked the beginning of the Allied push to liberate France and the rest of Western Europe during World War II, with the largest seaborne invasion in history, which became known as Operation Neptune. The landings were part of Operation Overlord, which proved decisive in shifting the balance of power in the war. The success of D-Day laid the groundwork for the Allied victory on the Western Front and marked the beginning of the defeat of Nazi Germany. Planning for this monumental invasion began in 1943, with a focus not only on military strategy but also on deception. A key element of the plan was Operation Bodyguard, an elaborate scheme designed to confuse German forces about the location and date of the attack. This strategy was coordinated from control in London. Section A of the British War Cabinet Department developed a draft plan called Plan GEL. The plan was presented at the Tehran Conference in November 1944 and approved in December, despite initial skepticism due to the failure of previous deception efforts. Operation Bodyguard, intended to deceive the German High Command, involved making the Germans believe that the Allied invasion would occur later than planned and in different locations. The Germans were forced to disperse their forces and move them farther away to avoid attacks in areas such as Padula, southern France, the Balkans, and even Norway. From Normandy, the Allies attempted to weaken German defenses as the invasion took place. One of the key aspects of the plan was to mask the massive buildup of Allied troops in southern England, diverting attention to other operations and focusing airstrikes across Europe. Allied military leaders knew the casualty rate would be surprisingly high during the invasion, but they understood it was a sacrifice they had to make to establish a strong foothold in France while the Allies prepared for the landings. Adolf Hitler ordered Field Marshal Erwin Rommel to lead the German defenses, including the construction of fortifications along the Atlantic Wall. Rommel was a respected military leader who had anticipated an invasion but was unsure of its exact location due to the success of Operation Bodyguard on the Allied side. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed him a major. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, entrusted him with the monumental task of leading the invasion. D-Day is often considered a turning point in World War II, the moment when the Nazis were deeply entrenched across Europe and a second front was desperately needed to help end the war. The Dawn of Destiny. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the world witnessed the largest amphibious assault in military history, an operation that would forever be etched in the annals of World War II. The scale of the operation was staggering. More than 5,000 ships and landing craft transported nearly 156 soldiers across the English Channel to the heavily fortified beaches of Normandy. The Allied forces were a multinational coalition that included troops from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and several other countries. The success of this operation was critical to the future of Europe. Hours before the infantry assault began, paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne units dropped from airplanes. The airborne divisions, along with British and Canadian paratroopers, were dropped behind enemy lines under cover of darkness. Their mission was crucial. They were tasked with securing key roads at bridges and other vital points to prevent the Germans from reaching the beaches with reinforcements. But the mission did not go as planned. Many paratroopers landed thousands of miles from their intended drop zones, scattered across the French countryside in the middle of the night. The chaos of these drops left small groups of paratroopers isolated, often behind enemy lines with little support. But what could have meant disaster was turned into an advantage thanks to their training and the element of surprise. These scattered units adapted quickly. They disrupted German communications, they launched ambushes for patrols and created confusion behind German defensive lines. The Germans didn't know where the strong points were located. When the attack came, we were left struggling to mount an effective defense when, with the outbreak of first light, the thunderous roar of Allied naval guns became audible. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers opened fire on German fortifications along the coast, unleashing a torrent of shells intended to soften the fire of the defenses. The bombardment was relentless, sending explosions along the coast in an attempt to clear the way for the thousands of soldiers who were about to land at 6:30 a.m. Waves of troops pounded the beaches, and the invasion was divided into 5 main landing zones, each with a designated code name: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Utah Beach, where the U.S. 4th Infantry Division landed, experienced relatively light and heavy resistance due to the efforts of paratroopers who had inadvertently cleared key defenses before the main force arrived. However, the story was far more brutal at Omaha Beach, just to the east. Omaha Beach became the bloodiest battlefield of D-Day. Here the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions faced all-out combat. The beach was littered with deadly obstacles: mines, barbed wire, and machine gun nests dug into the cliffs overlooking the shore. When the landing craft opened their ramps, the soldiers were immediately met by a storm of bullets, mortar fire, and artillery. Casualties were catastrophic, and many men were killed before they even reached the sand. However, despite overwhelming odds, the U.S. troops from Omaha displayed remarkable courage and tenacity, slowly advancing through overwhelming odds. With great determination and at great personal cost, they began to break through the German defenses. Small units advanced, clearing bunkers and machine gun nests, while reinforcements continued to arrive from the sea. Inch by inch, they fought their way from the beach toward the high ground. Further afield, British and Canadian forces from the east were assaulting the golden beaches of Juno and Sword. The landings met with fierce resistance, but coordination between air, sea, and ground forces allowed them to make significant progress on Juno Beach. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division encountered stiff opposition, but fought off its forces. The British 50th Infantry Division, which advanced inland and secured vital positions on Gold Beach, faced moderate resistance from German forces. They quickly adapted to the challenges of the terrain. Their mission was crucial to securing key objectives and advancing inland. By the end of the day, they linked up with Canada. The forces on Juno Beach formed a solid front against the enemy, which was no small feat, as every inch gained meant overcoming bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery positions. The Canadian 3rd Infantry Division, which landed on Juno Beach, faced similar challenges: strong German defenses and the treacherous beach terrain. Despite facing intense enemy fire and difficult conditions, the Canadians fought with incredible tenacity. Their objective was to penetrate deeper into enemy-held territory, and by the end of the day, they had made significant gains. Their determination not only secured Juno Beach, but also allowed them to join forces with the British and strengthen the Allied position along the Normandy coast. Meanwhile, on Sword Beach, the British 3rd Infantry Division faced the stiffest resistance of the day. The German defenses were well prepared with obstacles, mines, and strong points to thwart any attack. However, the British had an ace up their sleeve and managed to prevent the invasion. These were specialized tanks known as Hobart Funnies. Designed to clear mines, traverse beach obstacles, and create safe paths for infantry, these armored vehicles were instrumental in securing Sword Beach. The Funnies played a vital role in clearing the way for British soldiers, allowing them to advance despite heavy resistance. By midday, Sword Beach was secured. British forces were moving inland. They were moving toward their objective of capturing Kong over the beaches. The roar of planes filled the skies. The Allies had achieved air superiority, a crucial point for the success of the invasion. Bombers and fighters carried out numerous missions throughout the day, targeting supply lines and reinforcements of the German defenses. Their presence provided much-needed support to the troops on the ground, and every bomb that fell and every strafing attack helped relieve the pressure on the advance. Despite the chaos and confusion that are inevitable in such a massive operation, the Allies managed to secure a foothold along the Normandy coast. At the end of the day, it was not easy, and the cost was incredibly high. Thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded in the first hours of the invasion, paying the ultimate price for freedom. The bravery displayed on those beaches was unparalleled, and the determination of the men who fought there was unwavering. As the day drew to a close and the sun began to set over the blood-stained sands of Normandy, what had been achieved in a few hours and would alter the course of history began to sink into the collective memory. The soldiers, many of them young and inexperienced, had faced unimaginable horrors on those beaches. They had seen their friends fall. They had endured enemy fire and navigated treacherous terrain, all under the constant threat of death. Yet they had risen to the challenge. The success of D-Day lay not only in the landings themselves, but in determination. The efforts of the men who fought that first day paved the way for the eventual liberation of France and the collapse of Nazi Germany. The beachheads established at Gold and Juno and at Sword were only the beginning, but they laid the foundation for the Allied victory in Western Europe, which would be achieved that evening. The Allies had breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall. They had not yet won the war, but the events of June 6, 1944, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, just 2 days after the invasion on June 8 of the same year. The first Allied cemetery in Europe was established to honor the fallen. Since then, military officials and memorial organizations have worked tirelessly to compile an accurate list of D-Day victims. The National D-Day Memorial Foundation has played a key role in this regard. At the Bedford, Virginia Memorial, the names of 4,414 Allied soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Coast Guardsmen who died on D-Day are immortalized on bronze plaques. Librarian and genealogist Carol Tuckwiller spent years researching the exact number of casualties on that fateful day, a figure that remains the most reliable count of those who perished during the 24-hour battle. German losses on D-Day are estimated at between 4,000 and 9,000, while the Allies captured 200,000 German soldiers as prisoners of war in the following days. The chaotic nature of the landings made it difficult for commanders to accurately document when many soldiers died, while hundreds more would fall in the Normandy campaign. The exact time of their deaths was often unrecorded, as the confusion of battle caused commanders to focus on victory rather than record-keeping, but their sacrifices are remembered. Count the fallen and obtain an accurate count of D-Day casualties. But it's far more complicated than it seems. The Normandy landings, the largest seaborne invasion in history, brought together more than 150,000 troops from various Allied nations to storm the heavily fortified beaches of Nazi-occupied France. The numbers are staggering, and the stories of bravery and sacrifice are endless, but the exact number of soldiers who perished that day is not possible to determine and remains elusive in the run-up to D-Day. Military advisors and planners face the difficult task of estimating how many soldiers would survive the operation. The estimates were grim. The paratroopers, dropped behind enemy lines to secure key positions, were expected to face a staggering 75% mortality rate, even for the soldiers who landed on the beaches. The predictions were harrowing, and many warned that most of the Allied troops involved might not survive the day these horrific scenes unfolded. The forecasts reflected the brutal reality of what was coming. There were heavily fortified German defenses, machine gun nests, artillery, and obstacles designed to make any approach nearly impossible, while thousands of Allied and Axis soldiers clashed amid chaos. During the battle, it was almost impossible to keep accurate records of deaths. Soldiers were often separated from their original units, making it difficult to trace who had died and where some ended up, far from where they had initially landed, while others were lost in the fierce fighting on the beaches and inland. Amid the confusion, many bodies went missing, and the number of casualties became a matter of estimates rather than accurate records. The fog of war made it difficult for historians to arrive at a definitive figure. Initial estimates of Allied losses on D-Day ranged from 5,000 to 12,000, a huge variation that reflected the difficulty of tracking deaths during such a chaotic, large-scale operation. Amid this uncertainty, Carol Tucker, a librarian and genealogist, dedicated years of her life to meticulously researching D-Day casualties. Working for the National D-Day Memorial Foundation. In Bedford, Virginia, Tucker set out to give a name and a story to every fallen soldier. His extensive research culminated in the most accurate count of Allied casualties on the 4,414th. Of these, around 2,000 were American soldiers, 2,000 were British, and around 340 were Canadian. Tucker began his meticulous work at the Normandy American Cemetery by marking June 6, 1944, as the date of death on every grave of soldiers who perished during the D-Day landings. To do this, he gathered information from after-action reports and the remnants of military records, although many had been lost in a fire. During the 1970s, he discovered that the U.S. military officially declared a soldier dead if he had been missing for a full year. As a result, many soldiers who went missing on D-Day were formally declared dead exactly 1 year later, on June 7, 1945. Tucker couldn't simply add all military personnel with a June 7, 1945 death date to his D-Day casualty list. He had to verify that each division of fallen soldiers had actually landed in Normandy in June. In 1944, many soldiers were still fighting in Europe and the Pacific, so their deaths were not related to the normal invasion. This complicated the task, which required constant cross-referencing, although experts acknowledge that his list is not completely complete and agree that it remains the most accurate. The first Allied cemetery in Europe was established on June 8, 1944, just 2 days after the D-Day landings, located near the Normandy beaches. This cemetery became a sacred place, ensuring that fallen soldiers were remembered not only as anonymous victims of war, but as individuals who had given their all for the cause of freedom. Today, the Normandy American Cemetery stands as a somber reminder of the cost of war, with row upon row of white crosses marking the graves of the fallen. The National D-Day Memorial in Bedford, Virginia, also serves an important commemorative function. Bedford was chosen as the site because it suffered the highest per capita loss of American soldiers on D-Day. 19 young men from the small town lost their lives during the landings. The memorial pays tribute to each of the 4,414 Allied soldiers who died that day, whose names are engraved on bronze plaques in permanent remembrance of their bravery. On the other side of the beach, the defending German forces also suffered heavy losses. Estimates put the number of German casualties on D-Day at between 4,000 and 9,000, including those killed, wounded, or missing. Many of these soldiers are now buried in the German military cemetery at La Cambe in Normandy, which serves as a reminder of the devastation of war on both sides. In addition to these losses, the Germans faced the capture of tens of thousands of soldiers by the end of the Normandy campaign. The Allies had taken approximately 200,000 German prisoners of war, one of the least discussed aspects of D-Day. The aftermath of what happened to the bodies of those who fell on the beaches and battlefields is one of the lesser-known consequences of that day. We've reached the end of this video. Tell us what you think in the comments section. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss out on future videos like this one. See you next time.